Abyssal Murmurs. Today, let's listen to 9 short horror stories you shouldn't listen to at night. Story 1. Buried Alive. Once, there was a beautiful maid who worked for a wealthy family. Her beauty captivated the husband, making it impossible for him to take his eyes off her. In a fit of jealousy, the wife ordered the girl to go far away to do a task, hoping she would never return. However, after completing her task, the girl came back. Her return drove the wife into a furious rage. She ordered that all of the girl's fingernails be pulled out, her hair and eyelashes completely shaved off. Then, she had the girl's mouth cut open, stretching her once charming smile all the way to her ears. All of the girl's teeth were yanked out, and a heated metal rod was pressed against her body. They buried the girl within one of the walls of the house, leaving only a small breathing hole. One night, while lying in bed with her husband, the wife felt an overwhelming sense of restlessness and anxiety. She couldn't sleep and had the feeling that someone was watching her, making her too scared to move. Trembling with fear, she pulled the wool blanket over her head and shut her eyes. She reached out with one hand to grasp her husband's hand for reassurance. But suddenly, the wife realized that the hand she was holding was incredibly soft and sticky, with some kind of thick, foul liquid, and even more terrifyingly, it had no fingernails at all. Story 2. The Mysterious Finger. My daughter came home late last night, around 11:50 p.m. We picked her up from a classmate's birthday party. When we got home, we put her to bed right away since it was quite late. After that, my wife went to our bedroom while I stayed up to watch football and ended up falling asleep on the couch. Suddenly, I woke up when my daughter whispered to me, "Daddy," while tugging at my sleeve. "Guess how old I'm going to be next month?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said as I pushed my glasses up to be more awake. "How old will you be?" She smiled and pulled out 4 fingers from her pocket. It is now 7:30 in the morning. My wife and I have been with her for nearly 8 hours without knowing what had happened. Even now, she still refuses to say where she got those 4 fingers from. Story 3. Walking at night. A middle-aged man, drunk and staggering, was making his way home, swaying as he walked through a deserted street, humming a tune incoherently. By chance, he saw a little girl sitting on the ground, scribbling in the dirt with a twig. He approached her and asked, "What are you doing out here at night, girl?" The little girl looked up at him, a strange smile on her face, while her eyes brimmed with tears. The frightening thing was her eyes, deep-set and shadowy. "I'm digging a hole to bury my father. He abandoned my mother and me, made her lose the baby, but now he's dead." The drunkard thought to himself that the girl must be so poor that she couldn't afford a proper burial, so he didn't pay much attention. Just as he turned to leave, he suddenly tripped over a branch on the ground and fell, hitting his head on a large rock, dying instantly. His body was buried in the mud and dirt, as if a grave had been dug for him. In the quiet, still night, with no one around, the chilling voice of the little girl echoed along with her mysterious laughter. Finally, it's done. Story 4. Halloween Decoration. In 2005, a woman in Delaware was found hanging from a tree on a road near her home. What is notable is that everyone saw this scene, yet for several hours, no one called the police. It turned out that when asked, many people believed that the woman hanging there was simply a decoration for Halloween. Story 5. Whose money is that on the ground? The girl held her boyfriend's hand as they walked down the street. "Look, someone dropped their money," she exclaimed. The boyfriend picked it up and examined it carefully. It was a fake dollar bill. He immediately tossed it away, and the wind carried the bill down to the middle of the road. The girl said, "Why did you throw it away? It's clearly real, worth 100,000. She hurried out into the street, picked up the bill, and waved it at her boyfriend, joyfully saying, "See, I told you it was real." A car suddenly came out of nowhere. In a pool of blood, the girl still clutched the fake dollar bill, now stained red with fresh blood. Story 6. Catching the night taxi. At midnight, I was the only one waiting for a taxi on the road when a taxi slowly pulled up right beside me. The driver rolled down the window and asked me, "Where are you three ladies going?" As soon as I heard that, I hurriedly opened the door, jumped into the car, and urged the driver to speed away, promising to pay double the fare. After the car drove off quickly for a while, my breath and heartbeat gradually stabilized. At that moment, the driver turned his head 180 degrees to face me and asked, "So where are you going now?" Story 7. Street noodle soup. One night, a factory worker was returning home late and felt hungry, but there were no shops along the road. He decided to stop at a street food cart to grab a quick bite. He ordered 1 bowl of beef balls with all the vegetables. Then he busily scrubbed his shoes, which were covered in dirt from just passing by the cemetery. Suddenly, a bowl of noodle soup appeared on the table, accompanied by the raspy voice of the elderly vendor. "Here's yours, young man." He jumped in surprise, turning to see the hunched old woman with a wrinkled face. Her deep, dark eyes were smiling at him, and he finally calmed down, patted his chest a few times, and dove into the meal with gusto. However, he was still puzzled inside. How strange. He hadn't heard any footsteps, yet she had somehow appeared next to him without him noticing. The bowl of noodles he was eating was definitely scooped from the steaming broth pot. Yet, as he chewed, he felt that although it was very delicious, it tasted as if it had cooled off for about 2 or 3 weeks. The next day, after finishing work, he craved the noodles again, so he tapped his colleague on the shoulder to invite him along. "Hey, want some street noodle soup? I just discovered this place that's really good." "Where?" "The old lady at the intersection near the BHA cemetery. It's close to your place, right?" His colleague suddenly seemed to remember something, speaking quickly. "Is she the old woman with the raspy voice and those deep, dark eyes?" The worker laughed and slapped his friend's hand. "That's her. I just ate there yesterday." Immediately, his friend turned pale, trembling as he said, "That old lady is dead. Are you out of your mind? She just died 2 weeks ago from slipping and breaking her leg on the stairs." The worker was left speechless, his mind suddenly recalling the bowl of cold noodle soup and the soundless footsteps from that night. Story 8. Buying a haunted house. I had a family and a little daughter. In 2019, my husband and I saved some money and bought a small house to move out on our own. The house wasn't too old, but I heard that no one had lived there for a long time because the previous owner went abroad. The house was quite suitable for our needs, with 2 bedrooms and a small fruit garden, making it very cool. Even during the summer heat, it felt pleasantly cool, almost chilly. While I was renovating the house, I found an old ceramic jar behind the kitchen that looked like something from a Chinese movie, sealed with a wooden lid. I opened it to take a look and found a piece of rope inside. It looked so beautiful that I decided to keep it. When I took the rope out, I discovered a talisman inside as well, which I threw away along with the rope. After living there for 2 weeks, strange things started happening. One night, while we were asleep, My daughter woke up crying and said she was hungry. Normally, she didn't have a habit of midnight snacking. Looking at the clock, it was already 1 a.m., so I tried to soothe her back to sleep, fearing that eating at this hour would not be good for her stomach. But she kept crying for food. "Go to sleep, dear. There's nothing to eat at this time. In the morning, Dad will take you out for pho," I comforted her. "In the cupboard, there are meat buns," she said. I found it a bit odd because several times I offered her meat buns, but she always said she didn't like them. Suddenly, she was asking for them out of the blue. I went down to the kitchen to steam some buns, and after she ate, she finally went back to sleep. The next day, I decided to let her have a snack an hour before bedtime. However, at 1 a.m., she still cried and complained of hunger again, so I had to steam buns for her once more. Normally, she would play around me, but during that time, she often vanished from my sight, and when I called for her, she would come running from the garden. In the morning, she couldn't eat much. She would eat a little bit, then spit it out, but at 1 a.m., she would inexplicably cry again for food. I bought snacks to keep in the cupboard. Once I bought some steamed sponge cake for her and put it in the cupboard while my husband was bathing her. Late at night, when she woke up wanting to eat, she said to me, "Mom, take the sponge cake for me to eat." "There's no sponge cake. I bought steamed sponge cake for you," I replied. "You bought sponge cake?" she insisted. I walked to the cupboard, took the cake out from the paper bag, and fed it to her. And sure enough, it was sponge cake. Perhaps the seller had mixed it up, but how could she possibly know that? "Did you check the cake?" I asked my husband. "No, I didn't even know what you bought," he said. Watching her gobble up the cake, she devoured 2 pieces in no time. "I find it a bit strange. She doesn't seem to eat like she usually does," my husband remarked in the morning. Our family dynamic was a bit different from others. My husband always believed in the supernatural, while I only trusted science. After my husband went to work, I got caught up with house chores, and when I called my daughter for dinner, I noticed her clothes were covered in mud. I asked her, and she said she was playing with dirt in the garden. While giving her a bath and changing her clothes, I saw a faint red mark on her neck. She said she didn't know what it was, and it didn't hurt. I thought she had gotten scratched while playing in the yard, which still wasn't cleaned up, so I reminded her to be careful and to only play close to the house. That afternoon, when my husband returned, our daughter ran in from the garden holding a piece of rope. "It looks like the rope from the jar." I threw it away, I said, since this rope also had dark marks just like the one in the jar. "What jar?" my husband asked. "The jar in the kitchen. When we were cleaning the house, I thought it was beautiful, so I kept it. Inside the jar, there was a rope and a talisman that I threw away." When I mentioned this, my husband's face darkened, and he took the rope outside and burned it right away. But it was from that day that my family's nightmare truly began. The next day, while I was taking a shower, I heard a woman's voice chatting outside. It was clearly a loud conversation, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I thought maybe my husband had come home with someone, and after finishing my shower, I stepped out but saw no one. At the same time, I heard my husband at the gate, and my child was sitting in the living room watching TV. I thought I had misheard the TV, so I didn't mention anything to my husband. On another occasion, while changing clothes in the bedroom, I distinctly heard loud, jubilant laughter outside. I was startled and opened the door to check, only to find my daughter playing by herself. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine.
That evening, I asked my husband,
"Have you noticed anything strange in our house?" "What do you mean?" My husband replied, "If you haven't noticed anything, then never mind. If it's about that thing, then yes." My husband began to share that he had seen strange things multiple times. Sometimes, while half asleep, he would see a dark figure at the foot of the bed, and there were times he'd heard voices while showering, just like I had, but he hadn't said anything because he thought I wouldn't believe him. He realized something was wrong ever since he noticed our child eating at odd hours and doing so in a strange way. Both of us decided that in a few days we would seek a spiritual practitioner, especially since my mother-in-law was coming to visit the next day. We needed to find a practitioner since I had never really believed in this stuff and hadn't paid much attention to it, leaving me unsure of who was skilled. The next day, my husband went to pick up his mother. As soon as she entered the gate, she asked why the house looked so gloomy. She also inquired if we had consulted a practitioner since the house had been empty for too long. She said that if we wanted to move in, we needed to perform a spiritual ceremony first, and mentioned that she knew a really good practitioner and would call him the next day to help us with the ritual. That night, my husband laid down a mattress for his mother and our daughter right next to our bed. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard my child screaming, "Grandma, Grandma, please don't kill my grandma." The little one cried out. My husband and I jumped up and turned on the lights, seeing my mother-in-law clutching her throat, mumbling and staring blankly at the ceiling. Mom, what's wrong?" My husband shook her. I was also massaging her legs, unsure of what to do at that moment. My husband stood up, took the water for the offering from the altar, poured it on his hands, and wiped it across her face and neck. She began to breathe heavily, then slowly returned to a normal breathing pattern until she fully regained her senses. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked. "It was choking me. It was choking me," my mother-in-law said in a scared voice. I brought warm water for her to calm down, and at that moment, I recalled what my daughter had said. "What did you mean when you said someone was going to kill Grandma?" I asked. "She's in our house," the child cried. "Who?" my husband questioned. "She's the one who eats with me at night. She wakes me up to eat and play." Both my husband and I turned pale, and the entire family didn't dare to sleep, keeping the lights on until morning. The next morning, my mother-in-law immediately called a practitioner. She mentioned that she had helped my aunt before and was very skilled, which further reassured me. I was afraid of being scammed and losing money without any results. Unable to get in touch with the practitioner, I felt like I was burning inside with worry. My husband suggested that we take his mother home first and leave our daughter with her for now. I was still terrified being home alone, and even during the day, I stood at the gate looking out for my husband's return. That afternoon, we finally managed to contact the practitioner, but he said he was far away and couldn't come immediately, promising to arrive in 2 days. My husband suggested we go to his mother's house in the meantime. However, due to some arguments with my brother-in-law before moving, I was reluctant. Besides, my husband and I hadn't been too affected yet. That night, while I was taking a shower, I heard voices outside. I was very scared, but tried to finish my shower quickly. I called for my husband, but got no response. While I was drying off, I heard a high-pitched laughter from behind me. I turned around in shock and saw a woman swaying from the ceiling of the bathroom. I screamed and ran out the door. After running a few steps, I collapsed from fright. The woman had a green, terrifying face, and her laughter still echoed in my ears. When my husband heard my scream, he rushed down to help me. At that moment, I was too panicked to point to the bathroom. When my husband looked, he saw nothing. After lying down for a while, I calmed down and recounted the story to my husband. He suggested that we keep the lights on and stick together wherever we went. That night, while we were sleeping, I felt a weight on my chest. When I opened my eyes, I was shocked to see a woman exactly like the one I saw in the bathroom, hanging from the ceiling, her legs flailing, eyes rolled back, and her tongue sticking out. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, as if something was blocking my throat. I wanted to shake my husband awake, but couldn't move because my body was stiff. That terrifying face drew closer to me, with hollow eyes and blood oozing from the corners of her mouth. At that moment, I summoned all my strength to finally scream, sitting up as if I had just woken from a nightmare, and urgently embraced my husband. We stayed awake together until morning. The next morning, after my husband left for work, I went to a friend's house until he came back. Out of fear, we decided to rent a motel for a night. The next afternoon, the monk arrived. As soon as he entered the house, he pointed to the room and said a woman was hanging there. The monk took out a jar of water and sprinkled it around the room. Suddenly, my husband dropped to his knees, clutching his throat as if someone were choking him, his eyes bulging. I rushed to hug him and cried. The monk told me to move aside and splashed water on my husband. The monk chanted something, then tapped my husband's forehead, chest, and neck. Only then did my husband exhale and stop struggling. The monk spread a cloth on the floor and laid out some stones, indicating that he was going to perform a ritual, while I sat next to my husband to pray. After the ritual, my husband regained his composure. The monk explained that the woman had a miscarriage, discovered her husband's infidelity, and committed suicide. Her unresolved anger kept her lingering in the house. Instead of performing a ritual to help her pass on, the husband had conducted a warding ritual to prevent her from causing disturbances, which kept her trapped in this house. This accumulation of resentment had grown stronger. When we moved here, I accidentally burned the warding talisman that the monk had given, allowing her to act out like that. Upon hearing this, I felt no more fear, only compassion for her, as we shared the same womanly plight in such a harsh fate. The monk said she cared deeply for my child and wanted to play and eat with the baby. When my mother-in-law came to tell the monk to leave, that's when she became threatening. After that, when my husband took the baby out, it made her even angrier. After the monk helped us and provided a talisman, nothing strange happened in our home anymore. The cold feeling disappeared, but the baby still mentioned occasionally why she couldn't see the lady playing with her. I could only tell the baby that the lady was busy going back to her hometown. Story number 9, a chilling short ghost story. The story takes place nearly 20 years ago. At this time, my mother had not yet given birth to me, and our family was very poor. My grandparents gave us a piece of land to build a house. Since we were still very poor, we built a simple mud house just enough to shield us from the rain and sun. From this point on, the eerie events in that mud house began. My father was a man who often went into the forest for logging. In other words, he was a poacher. He was used to the wilderness, so wild animals and ghostly matters were nothing unusual for him. My dad recounted, whenever he slept in the house, just around midnight while lying down, he could distinctly feel someone climbing onto him and pressing him down. At that moment, he was startled and struggled to open his eyes, but couldn't. In his mind, he realized he was being haunted by an evil spirit, so he tried his best to shake off that ghostly hand. After a while, he felt lighter again, and when he woke up, there was no one there. However, strangely enough, On both of his upper arms, the imprint of someone's hand was clearly visible, as if someone had gripped his arms tightly. Then, in that old house, there was another story. While sleeping, my mother heard the sound of pots, pans, and dishes clanging as if something was shaking. She thought there might be a rat, so she got up to head to the kitchen. But when she got there, she no longer heard the clanging of dishes. When everything returned to normal, she went back to bed. A little later, she heard a sound again. But this time it wasn't from the kitchen. It sounded like a baby laughing and playing in the house. When she opened her eyes, she was petrified. Near the bed stood a pale-faced woman holding a child, suspended in the air, looking at my mother, and it seemed she was smiling. In that moment, my mother could only scream loudly to wake my dad. Hearing her shout, my dad woke up and asked what was wrong, so my mother recounted the entire story to him, and he comforted her. Later on, after my mother gave birth to me, we managed to buy a nicer house nearby and didn't encounter any more spirits. When my dad asked my grandmother about it, she said that when she was young, it seemed that the land our house was on had buried the child of a neighbor because the mother had difficulty giving birth, and both mother and child died from exhaustion. At that moment, my dad got goosebumps. Today's 9 stories have come to an end. Thank you all for your continued support. I wish you good health, and don't forget to subscribe to support me. Please leave a like and a comment. Best regards, and see you in the next videos.